You might think that when she finally sees you have moved on, she will just let you go in a quiet and peaceful way. You might believe that she will just nod her head and say goodbye without any fuss. But I want to tell you the real truth about what happens in the heart. The very second she understands that she has truly lost you, not just that you aren't there in person, but that your mind, your heart, and your spirit have moved somewhere else, that is exactly when she starts acting like a different person. She will treat you in a way you have never seen before. Let me sit down and explain what is really going on here. My name is Sophia Joy, and I'm the host of the Female Touch YouTube channel. And today I want to talk to you about something that almost every man misunderstands at some point in his life. Now, before we go any further, I want you to slow down with me for just a moment. Because if you are listening to this right now, there is a very good chance that you have experienced something confusing, maybe even painful. Maybe there was a woman in your life who seemed distant. Maybe you felt like you were the one trying, the one chasing, the one holding everything together. And maybe, at some point, you finally reached a place where you stepped back, and suddenly, something changed. Suddenly she started acting differently. Maybe she reached out after weeks of silence. Maybe she became curious about your life again. Maybe she started watching your social media stories more closely. Or maybe she showed up with a message that seemed casual on the surface, but carried a strange emotional weight underneath. If that has ever happened to you, I want you to know something very important. You are not imagining it. There is a real psychological shift that happens when someone realizes they have truly lost access to another person's emotional energy. And today, we're going to explore that shift deeply. Not from a place of blame, and not from a place of anger, but from a place of understanding human psychology. Because the truth is, the moment someone realizes they no longer have the emotional security they once took for granted, something very powerful begins to happen inside their mind. And if you stay with me until the end of this video, I'm going to help you understand exactly why that shift happens, how it changes the way she sees you, and most importantly, what it means for your own growth and self-respect moving forward. But before we dive deeper, I want to ask you something. Have you ever noticed how people often value something more after they lose it? Think about it for a moment. A person might have a supportive partner for years, someone kind, someone loyal, someone patient, and yet somehow, over time, that presence becomes normal. It becomes expected. It becomes part of the background of life. Until one day, it isn't there anymore. And suddenly, the silence feels different. Suddenly, the absence becomes noticeable. Suddenly, the mind begins replaying memories that once felt ordinary but now feel meaningful. This is not just about relationships. This is a pattern deeply rooted in human psychology. There is a concept in behavioral psychology known as scarcity value. When something feels unlimited or guaranteed, our brains tend to assign it less urgency. But when something becomes scarce, when it becomes uncertain, its perceived value increases dramatically. And emotional attention works the same way. If someone believes they always have access to your time, your affection, your patience, and your understanding, they may unconsciously stop recognizing how valuable those things actually are. Not because they are cruel people, not because they intentionally want to hurt you, but because the human brain adapts to what feels stable. Now, here is where men misunderstand the situation. They think that if they finally step back, if they finally stop chasing, the woman will simply move on without noticing. They imagine that their absence will not matter. But in reality, something much more complex is happening behind the scenes. At first, she might appear calm, maybe even indifferent. Maybe she seems perfectly fine continuing her life as usual. And this is the moment when many men become confused. They see the silence, they see the lack of reaction, and they assume it means she never cared. But the truth is, that silence often means something else entirely. Very often, it means she is watching, not obsessively, not dramatically, but quietly. She is observing the situation. She is waiting to see whether this change in you is temporary or real. You see, if there was a pattern in the past where you pulled away for a few days, maybe even a week, but eventually came back with the same emotional intensity, then she has learned something about that pattern. She has learned that your distance does not last. She has learned that eventually you will return. So when you step back again, she assumes the same thing will happen. At first, she might simply wait. She might think, give it a little time. He'll reach out again. And this waiting phase is important to understand. Because during this phase, she is not panicking. She is not feeling loss yet. She is simply observing the pattern she believes she understands. But then something unexpected happens. The days pass, and you don't send the text. The weeks pass, and you don't call. A late night goes by when you normally would have messaged her, and nothing appears on her phone. And slowly, very quietly, a new thought begins forming in her mind. What if this time is different? This is the exact psychological moment when the emotional landscape begins to shift. Because now, for the first time, the certainty she once had about your attention begins to disappear. And the human brain does something fascinating when certainty disappears. It starts searching for answers. It starts replaying memories. It starts asking questions. Why hasn't he reached out? Is he really moving on? Did I lose him for good? This is the moment when the emotional dynamic that once felt predictable becomes uncertain. And uncertainty creates curiosity. Curiosity creates attention. And attention often leads to renewed interest. But here's where we must be very careful with the narrative. Because many men interpret this shift in a very simple way. They think, she suddenly realized how amazing I am. Sometimes that can be part of it. But often, the deeper psychological mechanism is slightly different. Very often, what she is reacting to is the loss of emotional access. For a long time, she knew that your attention was available, your affection was available, your patience was available. And when those things suddenly disappear, the mind instinctively tries to understand why. Now let me share something important with you here. If you're finding this insight interesting so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps this community grow, and it tells the algorithm that conversations about emotional intelligence and healthy relationships matter. And if you're comfortable sharing, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a situation where someone only seemed to notice your value after you stepped back? Your experiences help others feel less alone. Now let's continue. There is another layer to this situation that most people don't talk about. When someone is used to being the one who controls the pace of a relationship, they unconsciously develop a sense of emotional authority. They believe they are the one deciding when conversations start, when they end, when closeness happens, when distance happens. And when the other person suddenly stops participating in that pattern, it disrupts the entire emotional structure. Imagine playing a game of tennis with someone who always returns the ball. You hit the ball across the net, and you expect it to come back. But one day you hit the ball, and nothing returns. The silence on the other side of the court becomes very noticeable. This is what happens emotionally when someone who always responded suddenly stops responding. And this does not mean the goal should be to manipulate someone into chasing you. That is not the purpose of emotional growth. The purpose is to reclaim your self-respect, because attraction, connection, and healthy relationships are not built on desperation. They are built on mutual respect. And respect begins with how you treat your own boundaries. In many relationships where one person ends up chasing, there is often a deeper emotional pattern happening inside. The chasing partner may feel that if they try harder, explain more, give more, be more patient, then eventually the other person will see their value. But ironically, this effort sometimes has the opposite effect. Because when someone feels that your attention is unconditional, they may stop feeling the urgency to protect it. And over time, that can slowly erode the sense of respect within the dynamic. Now, this doesn't mean you should become cold. It doesn't mean you should stop caring about people. It simply means that caring about someone should never come at the cost of abandoning your own dignity. And when you finally reach the moment where you genuinely step back, not as a tactic, but as a decision for your own well-being, something powerful begins to happen inside you. Your energy changes. You stop waiting for validation. You stop measuring your worth by someone else's response, and that internal shift becomes visible to others in ways that are difficult to fake. People can feel when someone is no longer chasing approval. They can sense when someone has become emotionally grounded. And ironically, that grounded energy is often what creates attraction in the first place. But there is another stage of this process that we still need to talk about. Because the moment she realizes your distance might actually be permanent, her behavior often changes in ways that surprise many men. Sometimes she reaches out with a very casual message. On the surface, these messages seem simple, but psychologically they often serve a deeper purpose. They are not always about restarting the relationship. Often they are about testing the emotional connection. She is trying to see whether the door is still open, whether you still respond with the same energy, whether the version of you she once knew is still there waiting. And what happens next depends entirely on how you respond. But that is where the real test begins. Because the way you react in that moment will determine whether the old dynamic returns or whether a completely new chapter begins in your life. And in the next part of this conversation, I want to walk you through exactly what happens in that moment, why many men accidentally reset the entire cycle, and what emotional strength actually looks like when someone from your past suddenly reappears. Because understanding that moment can change the entire direction of your future relationships. Now let's talk about that moment when she finally reaches out. This moment reveals more about emotional dynamics than almost any other point. Unexpectedly, your phone lights up. Many women will not openly say, "I miss you." Instead, the message will be casual, a test of the emotional connection. She is checking whether the door to your attention is still open. If it swings open too easily, her curiosity slowly fades. But if the version she encounters feels grounded and self-directed, her perception shifts. Independence is one of the most powerful signals of self-respect. Genuine confidence is quiet. It simply exists. When you no longer depend on someone else's approval, you begin to carry that same energy. The goal was never to make someone regret losing you. The goal was always to become someone who never abandons himself again. Now let's talk about something deeper. What does a man actually look like when he is truly let go? Not the version who is pretending to move on. Not the version who is ignoring messages just to prove a point. Not the version who secretly checks her social media every night hoping to see signs that she misses him. I'm talking about the man who has genuinely shifted his focus back to himself. Because when that shift really happens, the changes are not dramatic on the outside at first. They are quiet, subtle, but they are incredibly powerful. He wakes up in the morning and his first thought is not about her. His first thought is about the day ahead. Maybe he gets up earlier than he used to. Maybe he starts taking care of his body again. Maybe he starts going to the gym, going for walks, or simply moving his body in ways that reconnect him with himself. And something important is happening in those moments. He is rebuilding discipline. Discipline is one of the strongest forms of self-respect a person can develop. When you begin keeping promises to yourself again, your brain slowly starts trusting you again. Think about that for a moment. When someone spends months chasing a relationship that drains them, they often break many small promises to themselves. They say they will stop checking their phone, but they check it anyway. They say they will stop reaching out, but they send one more message. Over time, those small broken promises weaken a person's sense of control over their own life. But when a man truly decides to move forward, he begins reversing that pattern. He starts keeping small commitments again. He says he will go to the gym, and he goes. He says he will finish a project, and he finishes it. He says he will focus on improving himself, and he follows through. Each of those actions rebuilds his internal confidence. And confidence is not built from compliments or external approval. Confidence is built from evidence. Evidence that you can rely on yourself. Now here is where the transformation becomes visible to others. When someone begins living this way, their energy changes. They are no longer looking outward for validation. They are creating it internally through their actions. And people around them notice this shift. Friends notice it. Colleagues notice it. Even strangers sometimes notice it. Because there is something unmistakable about a person who is comfortable with themselves. They move differently. They speak differently. They listen differently. They are not trying to impress anyone anymore. And ironically, that authenticity becomes very attractive. But there is something else happening inside this transformation that many people overlook. He is no longer mentally living in the past. Think about how exhausting it is when your mind constantly replays old conversations. What did she mean by that? Was there something I could have said differently? Did I lose her because of something I did wrong? These thoughts can trap a person in a loop for months or even years. But when someone truly begins moving forward, their mind gradually stops feeding that loop, not because they are forcing themselves to forget, but because their life becomes full again. They have goals to chase, they have skills to build, they have experiences to create. And slowly, the emotional space that relationship once occupied becomes smaller and smaller. Until one day, something surprising happens. They realize they went an entire day without thinking about her. Then a few days, then a week. And the absence of those thoughts feels peaceful, not empty, peaceful. That is the real sign of emotional freedom. Now I want to share an important truth with you. A man who has truly let go does not avoid her because he is afraid. He avoids the old dynamic because it no longer fits his life. If he runs into her somewhere, he is calm. He is not bitter. He is not angry. He does not need to prove anything. He simply exists in that moment with quiet confidence. If she asks how he is doing, he answers honestly but briefly. He does not try to impress her. He does not try to make her jealous. He simply speaks like someone who has nothing to prove. And that kind of emotional stability can be very surprising for someone who once knew him in a completely different state, because the man she remembers may have always tried to explain himself. He may have tried to convince her to understand his feelings. He may have spent long hours discussing problems, searching for reassurance, or trying to hold the connection together. But the man she sees now does not do that anymore. Not because he has become cold, but because he understands something important now. He understands that the right connection never requires someone to beg for understanding. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect and mutual effort. And once someone truly learns that lesson, they stop fighting for attention in places where it is not freely given. Now I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever met someone who seemed completely at peace with themselves? Someone who didn't seem desperate for approval? Someone who didn't chase validation from everyone around them? That kind of person carries a quiet strength. They are not loud. They are simply comfortable in their own skin. And that is the energy many men begin developing once they fully stop chasing someone who could not meet them halfway. But let's go even deeper. Because letting go is not just about walking away from someone else. It is also about raising your standards for your entire life. Think about this carefully. The same habit that allowed someone to treat you as optional in a relationship might also appear in other areas of life. Maybe you tolerated friendships where your effort was not returned. Maybe you accepted work environments where your time and talent were undervalued. Maybe you developed a pattern of prioritizing everyone else's needs before your own. When someone begins rebuilding their self-respect, those patterns start changing too. They begin valuing their time more. They begin setting clearer boundaries. They become more selective about who they invest their energy in. And this is not selfish. It is healthy. Because people who respect themselves attract people who respect them. Now let me tell you something interesting about this stage of growth. As you begin raising your standards, your social circle may change. Some people who were comfortable with the old version of you might feel uncomfortable with the new one. Why? Because the old version may have been easier to take advantage of. The new version has boundaries. And boundaries often reveal who truly respects you and who simply enjoyed your availability. But do not be discouraged by this shift. This is part of the process. Because as your standards rise, you begin attracting different kinds of people into your life. People who value your time. People who appreciate your presence. People who do not play emotional games. And when you eventually meet someone who meets you at that level of mutual respect, the difference will feel obvious. The connection will feel lighter, easier, more natural. You will not feel like you are constantly proving your worth. You will not feel like you are fighting to keep someone's attention. Instead, the energy will flow in both directions. Now here's something many people find surprising. When a man reaches this level of personal growth, the woman from his past often notices the change. Sometimes she sees it through mutual friends. Sometimes she notices it through social media. Sometimes she simply senses the difference when they cross paths again, and something inside her shifts. Because the version of him she once knew was chasing her. But the version she sees now is building a life. That transformation can create a completely different perception. The man who once seemed emotionally dependent now appears emotionally grounded. The man who once tried to prove his worth now seems naturally confident. And losing access to that version of him can feel very different from losing the version she once took for granted. But there is still one final truth we need to talk about. Because at some point, she may reach out again. And when that moment comes, the decision you make will reveal whether your growth is real or whether the old cycle still has power over you. And that is exactly what we are going to explore in the final part of this conversation. Because the moment someone from your past tries to step back into your life can be one of the most important crossroads. And how you respond in that moment will shape the direction of your future relationships. Let's talk about that next.